A square aspect ratio or a rectangular one? Which one is right? Which one is wrong? Here's a tip. It's a trick question. Hey folks, Tito here, keeping my ideas outside of the box. I have a bit of a new setup this week. You'll notice that familiar light from last time in the background somewhere, but you'll also notice that I have a little bit of a more, let's call it balanced softbox setting up my lighting rig this go around instead of the warmer tones that I used to have that made me kind of look like I had jaundice. So I just want to kind of know from your comments on watching this video whether or not you prefer this format or maybe the warmer tones. So make sure you leave a comment before I make any other videos, right? And then I'll know. So our video this month for March, by the way, I'm 3 for 3 for 3 months so far. So, check on me around June and we'll see how I'm doing. But this month's video is actually about Justice League, a movie that came out and is about to come out again. For those of you not following what's going on with Warner Brothers and HBO Max right now, is they put a lot of money in re-releasing Justice League, but this time it's what's known as the Snyder Cut. What this is essentially Zack Snyder's original vision of what the Justice League was supposed to be. For those of you, again, not in the know, Justice League was finished by director Joss Whedon, who's now kind of taken a bow out of the public limelight due to some personal stuff, which I won't get into this channel, but if you guys go on the internet, you'll be able to see all the details around what that's about. But Zack Snyder essentially had to leave the project, and a 2-hour cut of the movie was released back in 2017, which wasn't really that well received. So since then, Zack Snyder has actually been kind of hinting that there is this Snyder Cut that exists that's close to about 4 hours long. And he even got HBO Max to give him money to do reshoots so that the movie could be released on the HBO Max, aka Crave here in Canada, platform this March. Now, what's really interesting is if you watch the trailers for this movie, you'll notice that it actually has a square aspect ratio along the lines of the old tube televisions that used to exist before flat screen became the predominant way that we watch our movies. And a lot of people have been commenting about, like, what's going on with this? Why is the movie shot wrong? And this kind of sparked a little bit of a conversation within the group ourselves, because there's members of our group that actually don't know why that is and why someone would film a movie square when the format has been 16:9 for so very, very long. Let's start by talking about aspect ratio and what it actually is. All aspect ratio really means is the width and the height of the image that you're looking on at your screen. Most television shows and movies now are presented in what's known as 16:9, which is the standard rectangle that you see on most flat screens. Now, if you have a PC monitor, you're going to see that curved screen now, because we're actually getting into those ultra wide monitor setups for gaming, as it were. And then there's the other format, also known as 1.37, which is also known as the Academy ratio. It's what basically TV's presented for the longest time. And a lot of people kind of equate it to old television and the square box look. So I figured I'd start by kind of talking about the history of why the square exists and how it became the rectangle. So let's start by talking about 4:3, aka the TV format, which was originally known as 1.33. At the turn of the 20th century, this was actually the very first format that all films were shot in, basically a square box. Shortly thereafter, though, came the advent of sound. And sound was actually put on the same image, or at least the information was put on the same image as the film that was being shot in, also known as 35mm film. A lot of people hear this a lot, or at least used to hear it before we started shooting digital. 35mm is basically the standard by which most movies were, and still, well, not anymore, but were shot for the longest time. And that format, 1.33, had to give way to 1.37. And the reason for that was because of sound. What had to happen as a result of sound being added to the 35mm print was that the image needed to be compressed a little bit in order to make it a little bit more boxy, but be able to fit sound in our image. Now, because that was the standard for films at the time, that's why the first televisions were actually box-shaped. They were set up in order to follow the format that what films were coming out at that time. So really, television was copying film first in the fact that it was released in a boxy format to match the movies that we were seeing in theaters.
He's looking at you, kid.
So why would we change from that format? Well, it's actually because of television. So as television became very, very popular, leading towards the 1950s, theaters needed to start figuring out gimmicks to get people to stop going home to watch television and movies and keep going to the theaters and giving out money to go see movies on the big screen. Does that sound familiar? Because really that's what's happening right now again. Well, pandemic aside, as it were. So what happened was a new format came out called Cinemarama. So Cinemarama was actually technically the first true widescreen, and the way they achieved this was by actually filming an image with 3 cameras. So instead of 1 square image, you had 3 square images all put together in order to make a widescreen effect. Now, the first films that came out in this format were actually set up to be kind of travel guide videos, showing kind of roller coasters and exotic locations so that people could see how real Cinemarama looked. In addition to that, theaters actually started having to create curved images to show the full image. And it wouldn't be until the 1960s that we would actually get the first feature film in Cinemarama. But let's rewind the clock back to the 1950s. Essentially, widescreen started becoming popular because of these Cinemarama videos, but studios wanted to cash in on this without having to buy the expensive equipment. So what ended up happening is they started releasing films in widescreen, but it wasn't really true widescreen. In fact, the first official widescreen movie, known as Shane, it wasn't true widescreen. In fact, it was cropped. So what the studio did was they cut the tops and the bottoms of the image in order to make a widescreen. But in order to do this, they actually had to blow up the image even further to fit on the widescreens that were available in the theaters at the time. And this caused for a bit of a grain effect when people were watching this movie. We see that as an aesthetic now, but back then it just meant lower quality movies. More studios followed suit, but also wanted to crack the code. There had to be a way to make widescreen accessible and affordable to make movies while still having that amazing effect and not losing quality. So over time, what ended up happening was the advent of Anamorphoscope. Now, for those of you not familiar with what Anamorphoscope is, essentially what it is the manipulation of a lens so that instead of it being a circle, it would be an oval. Now, the question is, why would you want to make a lens that's oval shaped? Well, in order to compress your image. The idea was to capture more information from either side of the screen, but fit it in a square cell of film. And the way they did this with that oval shape was to record the movie in a way that it would be compressed, and then in post-processing you could stretch it out. Now this gave way to what we now know as anamorphic lenses. And that's where those cool streaks come from. The reason you get those streaks is because in the post-process of de-anamorphizing an image, you stretch the image, which also stretches the light. That now we see as an aesthetic effect. Are you starting to kind of get the theme here that a lot of what we do now in film is based on aesthetics that we liked from old films?
Airlocking torpedoes. Emergency evasive. Fire everything!
So to fast forward back to the 1960s, by the time Cinemarama had been coming out with their first feature films in fully featured Cinemarama, a lot of studios had flipped over to anamorphic lenses as well as new film stock formats that kept the quality of the image while still having that stretch of widescreen. In fact, our boy Hitchcock ended up filming a lot of his films in what's known as VistaVision, which is what we now know as the 1.85 format that's most widescreen movies that we see. By the way, Alfred Hitchcock also coined the term the MacGuffin, which is our namesake.
Give me your hand.
So the common denominator up until this point was 35mm. Essentially, how do we manipulate either the lenses or the image in order to fit in that canvas? Well, what happens when filmmakers want a bigger canvas? Well, that resulted in what we now know as 70mm film. 70mm film became a game changer in many different ways, which would eventually come out with the format we know as IMAX. And why is IMAX important? Well, this comes right back to the original piece of our conversation that we started with, Zack Snyder's Justice League. Essentially what happened was Zack Snyder saw the Dark Knight trilogy, and for those of you that know, a lot of big scenes in the Dark Knight trilogy were shot in IMAX, and those were actually in a much squarer format because that is how IMAX films. So essentially what happened was, while watching these movies, a lot of people who own the Blu-rays will notice that you'll have a square format change change when you transition from those IMAX scenes to the regular movie. Because Christopher Nolan, the director of the films, shot most of the movie in 35mm and only the big set pieces in IMAX. What Zack Snyder decided to do was not only film his scenes in IMAX, but also film the entire movie in the same format as IMAX, not shot in IMAX, but in the format of IMAX, in order to make sure that the audience didn't feel those transitions between the IMAX scenes and the regular scenes. Was Zack Snyder wrong in doing this? Well, in order to answer that, let's go back to 16:9, which is the standard for televisions right now. When we watch our movies on Netflix, on TV, or in our DVDs, for those that still own them, and Blu-rays, you'll notice that there's actually movies that have bars on the tops and the bottoms. Why is this? Why wouldn't those bars be completely eliminated if we had a TV format that was meant for widescreen? Well, that's because the TV format wasn't necessarily meant for widescreen. 16:9 was actually the middle ground. It was decided back in the 1980s, when they were actually developing that format of 16:9, that it was probably the best box to fit movies and TV shows in. The main reason was because you'd have the same amount of black bars on the tops and the bottoms as you would on the left and the right of your screen, essentially making it so that whatever you're watching, you see minimal black bars and the full scope of the image without being obstructed or with the entertainment value of what you're watching. So to bring it all home, the real answer is that all formats are right. You just got to think a little bit outside of the box you're watching them in. Will seeing Zack Snyder's Justice League in its original aspect ratio make the movie better? Likely not, but at least we'll be seeing the director's full vision, literally. But what are your thoughts? Do you think movies and TV should be filmed in order to fit the 16:9 aspect ratio and fill your entire TV screen? Or is it better to have filmmakers choose their own aspect ratios based on the story they're trying to tell? And while you're at it, now that we've finished this vlog, what do you guys think of the new lighting setup? Do you guys like this more even light, or would you prefer me to go back to a warmer, more stylized method? Make sure you leave your comments below, and until next time, this is Tito saying, learn to be professional, but keep that indie passion.